Welcome back to the Fly Culture Podcast, your weekly look inside the world of fly fishing presented by Pete Tigers. If you're enjoying listening, please consider subscribing.
Daire Whelan is a writer and fly angler who has written for Fly Culture and has recently published Haunted by Waters, a book that chronicles a year of fishing in Ireland. I learn about what went into putting the book together, along with his fishing career, what fishing means to him, conservation, and much, much more. Daire, it is great to have you along on the Fly Culture podcast today. How are you doing?
Great, Pete, and thanks a million for having me on. I'm looking forward to this. I've been listening to your podcast for a good while, and so I feel like I'm in hallowed company.
Oh, I don't know about that. You're most welcome along, and obviously as a contributor of Fly Culture, I think it's 2 or 3 pieces that you've written for us, which I've thoroughly enjoyed, and I know the readers have too. We're sitting here, certainly in my part of the world, it is incredibly miserable. I was thinking about going down to the river to do some pruning to make access a little bit easier for me when things have grown up. But of course, having read your book, which we'll come on to shortly, you open for salmon on January the 1st. So does that mean you've been out? And what are those sort of conditions like? What is it like braving those first few days of the year?
It's for the hardy. I think is the best way of describing it. I didn't get out this year. It's a bit of a kind of a pilgrimage, and it's funny actually. And it was only kind of afterwards when I was looking through the book I'd written. Some of the chapters kind of had titles like pilgrimage, and it was faith, and that there was a certain kind of kind of spine coming through. I think that was kind of related to that side of it, but we'll get onto that in a little bit. But yeah, the Drowse, it opens on January the 1st. The Liffey also opens, the river that flows through Dublin. Very rarely fished. There's not much on it nowadays. So kind of the Drowse is seen as kind of the traditional kind of people make the trip from, all across Ireland to be there. Really, and it would have always, a lot of the time traditionally had the first salmon of the season. So you would have had, going back, in the newspapers, it would have been, you would have heard of the Drowse, where the first salmon was caught. Interestingly, in recent years, the run has gotten later. So the first fish of the season being caught, I think it was a couple of years ago, like it was February by the time it got caught. This year it was January 13th, if memory serves right. So it's kind of into the second week of Jan, which is kind of earlier than it has been. But it's a great day. It's a great tradition to go up. I went up a couple of years ago. Even just the whole process of it, I think there's something very kind of the routine and of it, putting your mind saying, right, I'm going to make the journey up. So I would have kissed the kids and the wife goodbye at like New Year's Eve at 7 o'clock, driven the 4.5 hours up to Donegal, up to the Leitrim Donegal border, booked in, spent the night alone on New Year's Eve. I think it was before midnight. I even, I was like, to hell with all that New Year's Eve stuff. Got up early at 6 o'clock in the morning, and there's something special because I remember just you're driving down the driveway of the Loreen estate, which is where the Drowse fishery is, that's owned by Shane Gallagher. And you drive down the driveway and you see the cars already there with the rods on the front of the cars, and you just get that sense of anticipation that there's something building, and you're, like I said, you're going more in hope than expectation of catching a fish, but there's that real sense of coming together and that the season is starting now, and you go into the fishery office with Shane. You get your license, and he has an open fishery policy that day. So basically, he doesn't charge people for the day. So you might get 100 plus anglers there. So it is a bit busy. It's not, if you're looking for peace and quiet on New Year's Day, you're not going to get it. But there's a real kind of camaraderie and coming together. So this year, and actually just recently, I'd spoken to Shane about opening day, how it went, and again, it went very well. Because of the pandemic in recent years, obviously there was kind of restrictions on people whether they're able to get up. So this was the first year in a kind of couple of years that there was no restrictions, and people felt back to normal. But it was interesting. Shane was saying how warm the conditions were. I think he said it was 14 degrees. Like, that's January, New Year's, like, unheard of. I remember actually even when I was fishing there, whatever it was, 4 years ago, like I was short sleeve shirt. I was walking down across the fields. I was sweating, like, with my waders on. So it's it's a different kind of maybe than what you think of in the last few years, or years gone by, where of snow and wind and rain and hail. So you do get that sense of things are changing like that. But like I said, just great to be out, and you mightn't see a fish, but you're casting a line and you're wetting the line, which is great. Like,
I like that, and the gathering, and that sounds really impressive as having 100 anglers there. And I guess that's, not that I've experienced it, a similar sort of thing that you might see in Scotland as well when they open those rivers. We don't have the same sort of thing here in that sense, but I get what you say about cars with rod racks on them, and you feel that camaraderie. And even now when I'm driving along and there's a car parked by the river, I wonder if that's a fisherman down there, and I think about that angler, and I wonder if they're having a good time. And the amount of car crashes I've almost had where I've been looking to see if I can find that angler on the river as well. But those things are really special. And I was going to ask you, funnily enough, because January the 1st, you think there's a chance of rain or high river and not fishable conditions. But with these changes you've seen, I guess, like we say, part of it is a marking of the season, but also is there situations where, the river will be washed out quite easily? And, is it a regular thing for that to happen, or is it more the other day, or do people say, sorry, I'm going anyway?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. Like, you know yourself, especially, with salmon fishing, it's, according to the conditions, and, there's less predictability around them nowadays anyway. But oftentimes you can be there and it's a complete washout. I know lads, years gone by, drove up during the night, wind, rain, hail, freezing their ass off. The river was just too high, and like after 2 hours, they just said, "Sod this! I'm too cold. I'm going up to the pub or going home." Like, that's just, it happens. That's part of fishing, isn't it? Part of fly fishing and salmon fishing as well in terms of conditions. But yeah, it is just kind of just dust down the cobwebs, and just people are just itching to get out.
I think that shows what it means to us, doesn't it? That you make a long drive with the potential of the river being completely washed out, but you don't care. There's something deep inside you that makes you want to do that and be, like you say, amongst people of your own kind as well, isn't that? There's definitely a sense of that, isn't there?
There's something of and again, talking about that kind of faith and spiritual, there's something of the communal, coming together around it. Like Shane Gallagher, you talk to him, he says, it's more important than Christmas, for his family, in terms of, they're so busy getting things ready, opening it up. And it's marking the traditions in the calendar and the seasons. Which I love to think about, and it harks back to pagan times as well. And then you think of kind of, say, the Blackwater down in Munster, Cork, Waterford, that'll be the kind of nearest, one of the two rivers, the Suir and the Blackwater, the rivers beside me. I'd fish the Blackwater most often, just because it's down the road from me. It's handy from a salmon fishing perspective. That opens on February the 1st, which again is that kind of traditional, nearly kind of springtime. In Ireland it's St. Bridget's Day. So you kind of got that sense of the church kind of latching onto those kind of ancient rituals of observing the passing of the seasons or the beginning of the seasons. So I always like that. I always feel like, especially when you go down on opening day, you're kind of observing those kind of ancient rites and rituals. Like on the Blackwater, for example, with Glenda Powell down there. There's reading of poems, and, like Scotland as well, there's the traditional pouring of the whiskey into the river. And it is that kind of sense of, we're marking the passage of the seasons, which, again, kind of makes me feel part of nature, and also as if we're just continuing on that kind of, those observations and those traditions going back, centuries, thousands of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting for me that you talk about from the salmon point of view as well. And having read the book, I got the sense that the Blackwater was really more so your salmon river, and the Suir was your trout water. From a trout perspective as well, and I think on this podcast I've talked before where I was on the river there somewhere or other at 11 o'clock at night, throwing G&H sedges to the sound of rising trout, which is one of those moments that will last with me probably for the rest of my days. But the trout, does that open where you are at a similar sort of time, or is it a little bit later? Is it March, more of a March opening?
Yeah, 17th of March is the traditional time. So that's coming up in the next few weeks on the shore and a lot of the rivers around here. And again, it's funny, it's interesting. So again, that's people know that's St. Patrick's Day. So there's a bit of a kind of a tradition there around it. And then also I remember reading how kind of March was actually the tradition back in the kind of Middle Ages, that was actually the actual traditional time when people celebrated the start of the year. So I know we had the winter solstice in December, but, you get that real sense. I think it's not until mid-March, end of March, that kind of, the sun and the heat is starting to come a bit. So again, there's those kind of markings in the season. And yeah, so it's 17th of March is the tradition. So again, it's another excuse to get out on opening day. And it can still be bloody cold, I tell you, then as well. We've had snow in the last few years over here around St. Patrick's Day, right up then. And my memories of going to any St. Patrick's Day parades as a kid in Ireland was just being absolutely frozen to the bones. So it takes a while for it all to heat up. So I definitely think the early season is kind of maybe the more committed type of fly angler who will want to get out and, see what's there, but realizing, really it's going to take a few weeks or a few months before the action starts to autumn.
And that was one of the questions I was going to ask you about. Is it an early season river? And I know Matt and Stuart I had on recently were talking about fishing and large dark olive hatches and everything else and rising fish. When is it that you're starting to see fish rise on the Suir and a little bit more activity at the surface, I guess?
Well, really, you'd be waiting until, May, later April into May, before any kind of sustained activity. But like I was out pike fishing, actually. The bit of fishing I've done this year so far was actually, funny enough, pike fishing locally. And it was during the day. And again, this would have been back in January. And a bit of sun came out. There was a nice bit of warmth. And suddenly there was the odd trout rising. And it's, this is in January, and it just shows you, it can happen any year. You get the right conditions, that little bit of sunshine, and it was just amazing to see the trout rise and come. Like they were just downstream from me, and I just, you just hear that. Plop. I just looked over and I saw it. And my God, it's January. And, it gives you a taste for what's to come. But I love. I have a young family, and kind of, I suppose, why the trout fishing and the shore appeals to me is that, a lot of times I might only, get an hour or two to get out, and it might be, when the kids are gone to bed or get up early morning, maybe during the week or weekends. But evening, especially, the kids are gone to bed. It's nice to, that the shore is only literally 5 minutes in the car down the road from me, that I can get out for an hour. I can see rising fish, or, at least, feel the pull on the line, and, hopefully catch a few trout. Whereas, with salmon, you have to put in the hours, you have to, be there and the conditions are right. But at least with trout fishing, it's that kind of look, I'll cast, get out for an hour, whether it's a bit of nymphing, dry fly if I can. It's just nice to be able to do that. And there's something very special, even now talking about it and, just wishing it was coming around again, is that, that time when it just gets into the dusk, it's about to hit the darkness, and just the river comes alive, for those few minutes. It could be even longer. And, where you think there's nothing, you might only hear the sporadic rise, and then boom, it's like the switch has been flicked, and just, they hear that river come alive like that. Even if you're not fishing it, I think there's something so magical. And I always try to say to people who are non-anglers to try and, get them down for a walk, just to experience it, just to be standing there, just to see what can happen, and how nature just, the magic of nature at that very, very special time. And then it's amazing, isn't it? It just switches off again, as if it wasn't there. And I love that feeling of standing there, hearing it first and foremost.
Yeah, it's what keeps us coming back, doesn't it? And like you say, I'd love to see those fish rising early season, but I don't mind waiting, and that's part of the excitement, part of the process that you go through as an angler. And when it is March, when we open at home, I'm thinking, well, I've got 6 months worth of it. And you're sort of thinking, even when you're 3 months into it, you're thinking, well, I'm only halfway through. And those things, you roll with exactly what's happening and the mood of the river and everything else. And it was interesting that you mentioned to me about pike fishing and doing a little bit of that. Looking ahead for this year, are you one of these people who plans, or I'm going to tick this off the list, I'm going to catch some more bass on the fly, or I'm going to catch some more pike or mullet or whatever it is? Are you one of those sorts of people, or you just go with the flow?
A bit of both. It depends, actually. It depends on the year. It depends what kind of mood I'm in. I am one of those, I kind of, like, I only took up fly fishing, what are we now, probably about 12 years ago. I used to course fish as a kid, and probably like so many, was introduced to fishing through course fishing. So I lived in Dublin, and, I was brought fishing to like the canals, the lakes, they would have been kind of like an hour and a half away. So it was not like I grew up with it, or I could just, go down to the local river and do it. Grew up in, classic just housing estate, suburban Dublin. But it just awakened something in me as a kid. And then after college, kind of, I suppose, when I had a bit more time and maybe a bit more money on my hands and car to drive, I kind of rediscovered fishing, and we moved down to Tipperary, which is near to Cork, south of Ireland. It's about 2 hours south of Dublin, where my wife was from. And as I said, the shore is nearby, but also there's a golf course beside it. And I knew, I'm one of these, I have to have a hobby. And I knew, okay, I said, I've got a choice here. I can't take up both, because I know myself, I'll just, have to dive into one or the other. And again, I'd done fishing when I was younger. I'd done a bit of golf as well. And all my friends played golf. They'd go weekend trips to the UK, to some of the famous golf courses. And I just kind of thought back to when I was a kid, and I said, no, fishing there's something special that just, it's just in me. I just, like, the tug is the drug. It's just, it's hard to explain, isn't it, to non-anglers? Like, what is it? And so I decided, look, I'm going to take up fly fishing and really learn how to do it properly, and, just dive into the whole sport, the hobby of it, the reading of it, the history of it, the skills, the tactics, the technique. There's just so much to it. And I think that was part of what I loved about it, was because I loved just learning and reading. And I think that was part of the fascination with the sport. And then there was the fly casting itself. And I think that's also why the salmon side of it appeals to me, because even if you're not catching it, I love being able to cast the line out and just, watch it go. And when you hit it right, maybe it's a bit, going back to that golf analogy, is a bit like when you hit that ping off the tee. When you hit it, when you can cast the line right, and it feels so good, and then if you can catch a fish, all the better. But so yeah, that's how I got into it back, all those years, the last 12 years or so. And it's just become such an immersive hobby, is even the wrong word. I think, and even sport is the wrong word for it. It's an immersive, I think, mindset, an approach to life, to nature, that I've been so grateful for, that I discovered when I moved down to Tipperary all those years ago.
Yeah, and you've alluded to it previously in a couple of minutes ago about that connection, isn't there? And there is a deep connection, and we've talked about it either consciously or subconsciously. The weather, what's happening on the river, the state of rivers, everything else that is going along. You feel as though that rhythm is intertwined with nature, isn't it? Yet there are so many other things to it. And as I always say, to non-anglers, or civilians, as I call them, if I had to explain it, they wouldn't understand it. And it runs incredibly deep, doesn't it? And it's a hard one to shake. Did you find, this is going to segue beautifully, did you find that writing was a natural another avenue? Because one of the things I love about fishing, and fly fishing particularly, is there are so many things. It might be tying flies, it might be, as you say, casting, it may be building your own rod, it may be fishing a bamboo rod, it may be discovering all those things. And did you find writing was another way to express a love for it, and a way to share your passion with other people?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, Pete. Is like, I don't tie flies. Again, it's just time. I write. That's my thing. I've got enough going on. And I wouldn't class myself. I'm not hugely skilled as a fly angler. I'm not hugely obsessive. I think it comes back to just something deeper. Maybe something more spiritual. I'm not, I wouldn't be massively knowledgeable in terms of kind of skill sets or anything like that. But for me, it comes back to the enjoyment I get from being out in nature, the enjoyment I get from immersing myself in the culture of the sport, listening to and reading about, in terms of the people that are involved in the sport. But yeah, it's funny when it came to the writing of it. I think this was my sixth book that I've written. I've been working in the Irish media for 20 odd years as a producer and as a journalist. So anything that you're involved in from your life that's of interest to you, I think naturally an extension of that is you're going to write about it, or you're going to be involved in it from a media perspective. That's just an extension of who you are and what you do. So it was just the really interesting thing, like compared to, like, I've written books about GAA, rugby, that side of things previously, and they would have been all commissioned. This is the first book I wrote without a publisher or without getting it published in mind. I just sat down and just started writing in the evenings, because it was just a natural thing to do, because just writing is one of those other things I do. And it just was felt right. It just felt like I just had this to say. There was people I had met, there was people I'd spoken to, and I just found their stories fascinating. I think that's part of, again, when I talk about the culture of fly fishing, and again, just from a fly fishing in Ireland, because that's my own experience of it thus far, is that there's so much history and stories behind it that I was just fascinated by. I studied history in college, so I'm just, anything going back, I'm just fascinated by that side of it. So I just found myself just writing, just by instinct, just off the bat, just doing it for myself. And, so whether it was the Drows, or whether it was, the Blackwater, or whether it was talking about Kerry, Quran, there's a chapter in my book where I talk about going back to ancient Celtic mythology, because it delves into it. And I'm fascinated by how the Celtic mythology of thousands of years ago spoke about salmon and fish, that it was so important. It was the life giver, the food giver. But then it was also so important culturally from a Celtic historical perspective. And I'm just fascinated how those same important things remain up to this day. Like if you take Quran as an example, or take Connemara, the history of Connemara around there as well. So for me, I was naturally telling those stories. And this is the amazing thing, is that I just sent off the chapters to a publisher I knew, and they loved it, and they jumped at it and wanted to publish it. And I couldn't believe it, because it was a mainstream publisher. I thought, fly fishing book, how much interest would it be? And they jumped at it because they thought, no, this appeals to something more. There's something about this that's not just about fly angling. It's about nature, and it's about the kind of wider context of where it is. So I was thrilled by it. And, I think when you sit down like that, it comes from the heart first and foremost. It's more authentic, it's more real, as opposed to maybe just a contract, professional contract for a book to write that you're doing from a professional perspective. This just came from me and who I was, and I kind of I was quite honest about it in terms of kind of I suppose a lot for me was the kind of I would have been working in Dublin quite a lot, and you're on the hamster wheel, and the frustrations of that, and then what fishing gives you as an outlet and as a kind of as an antidote to that. So I kind of write about that. And I'd say that the reaction I got from people is non-anglers as well. People just went, I really enjoyed it, because what it kind of spoke to them, whether they're into fishing or not, they could identify with some of those things I was talking about.
Do you think that was easier to write then, on the basis that, as you say, you were writing from the heart? So I find, if I'm writing whatever it may be, that if I'm in the right mood or the subject is right, the words flow a lot more easily. Did you find that as part of your process as well, as you described, writing from the heart? That made that easy to write, did it?
Yeah, 100%. Like, I lecture in journalism, and I have been doing for years. And I always say to the students is, you got to write about, and look, this is the same with, like, whether you're writing books or whether you're writing journalism articles, you got to write from what you're experiencing, because the most interesting writers, especially the non-fiction journalism ones, are the ones who are experts in a certain area, are the ones who live a life that that they are living this life completely dedicated to this topic. Like when I started in sports journalism years ago, the sports guys I was coming across, these were guys who were just immersed in this world sport, whether it was football, whether it was cricket, rugby, GAA over in Ireland. And it meant so much to them. So writing was just a natural extension of them expressing their interest and their love for what they were doing. And the best journalists are always those. So whether it's politics, whether it's economics, any side of it, those are the best journalists, because their lives are immersed in that. And that's the one point I'll always say to kind of students when I'm talking about journalism. So likewise, for me, it was a case of this was where my head was at. This was where my heart was at. This was how I wanted to express myself. And, likewise, when I don't work in sports journalism anymore, but when I used to work in it, I was surrounded by sports figures, sports stories that I thought, my God, they'd be great stories. Let's write about them, which I did. Likewise, now it's funny. I can't get away from the fly fishing world now, because that's just where my mind is at, that I find and come across all these incredible stories, and even the ones that I write, that I've written for you, Pete, for the magazine, is that you just feel this is where my head is at. This is where my life is at. My life has changed since I moved down to Tipperary. I live on a farm. I live beside the shore. I fly fish. I have young kids. It's a totally different life than the one that I would have spent in, the big city, working in the world of journalism. Now I've taken a bit of a step back, and maybe I'm just getting old, but that's the kind of just the topics that are of interest for me. And, I'd love to do another volume of these kind of stories.
Yeah, I think that would be great to have. And we're going to start to drill down in that a little bit more. But I was looking through what you'd written for us this morning. And was that had that sort of fire ignited about the book then? Was that sort of how you were starting to think about things, and you thinking, actually, I'd like to do that? Or was it as a result of the other articles you've written for us and elsewhere? Was that the process? How was that process at that stage?
Yeah, I think it's probably started, it was probably an organic thing that, once I started writing articles, I just found myself enjoying it. Like you said, it comes back to it's easier. Like sometimes you write things and Jesus, it's like pulling teeth. And a lot of times, especially if you're stuck mid-story, you kind of go, no, there's a reason why this isn't flowing. When it flows, now sometimes you just have to stick it out, but I do feel when it flows, it feels better and it reads better, and it's a better writing, and it's a better story. And yeah, the articles that I started writing for, they came naturally. The voice I have, the stuff I do, it's not how to, because I don't have that expertise. I'm kind of more interested in life and people, and then how that kind of interweaves and intertwines with, our fly fishing and, nature and all of that kind of stuff. So I just found that came naturally to me, and that's where my kind of natural interest was. And I was thrilled when, you liked it and that you felt it fit, because, a lot of other fly fishing publications or platforms might think, no, that's a bit too maybe ethereal or too kind of a bit out there. But what I love is that I honestly believe that personal truths are universal. That, what we think we're going through that is unique to ourselves, it's not. Our beliefs are, especially say with a fly angling community, that what we approach and what we get out of it and our kind of thoughts and attitude towards it, you actually find are pretty much reflected probably a lot across the board. So whether you're in England, Scotland, Ireland, America, Australia, New Zealand, I think there's a universal appeal to that about what we get out of fly fishing itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, it seems that if you're writing, and for fly culture as well, using that as an example, I guess there are more pieces that I prefer to read myself. And I didn't want to go down the how-to route similarly to yourself. And I think even the longevity of a book like Haunted by Waters is that will continue in the fly fishing ether, whereas a how-to book, although incredibly useful, will be superseded by something else. That is a standalone piece that people can read and enjoy for years to come. And I hate to use the legacy word, but they're wonderful pieces, with our little magazine and, your wonderful book. They're lovely that your children will also be able to see what you've done when they're a little bit older too, won't they?
There's a legacy thing there, I think, and it's something I'm kind of a bit more conscious of, Pete, with the writing, and I think you probably are maybe with the magazine, is that when you kind of look back, and I don't mean, far off future and you're looking back. But even in a short term, that you can look back, you look on the shelves and you can kind of say, yeah, I've done that. I've brought that into the world. I've created that. That's there. I have 3 kids, and each of them has a book dedicated to themselves. And I do hope, they don't have to read them when they're older. I hope they're into fishing. But they know that's it there on the shelf. That's it there on the wall. That's a bit of my legacy kind of left to them, for generations to come. So I think that is the beauty of kind of whether you're creating magazines, books, anything creative like that. And that because it comes from what we're, so interested in, that it's very authentic and much more real to the people that we leave it behind too.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to move on to your book. As I've said, it's called Haunted by Waters. I've read it all, and I have to admit that you had me with the prologue where you talk about what fishing means to you while swinging a fly on the Blackwater, and it captures it perfectly. It really does. I want to bring up some of the sections and talk about those, but could you give listeners an outline of what it's about? Just so that they get a sense of it.
Yeah, no problem. So basically, I suppose what it was for me was, like I said, I kind of had started, initially when I was like I said, I was working in Dublin a lot. So I would have been getting the train between Tip and Dublin a good few times a week. Yeah, and, you just kind of get burned out, and it's a lot in terms of travel and work and all that kind of stuff. And I remember, I think it was just like a cold, wet evening coming home, stuck in the train, and you're kind of thinking there's more to this than that than there is. And it's not like, we can't just give up our job and, head off into the woods to fish. Like, we've got responsibilities. But what I did was I did make a conscious decision for myself to say, no, I'm going to spend more time in terms of planning it out. And you asked about planning. And this was a year where actually, maybe I should plan more actually, because there's good things come of it. But you asked about planning, and I actually said to myself, no, I'm going to sit down. I'm going to make a commitment to myself to go fish the places that I wanted to get to in Ireland. And it wasn't like as if I was going every weekend. I couldn't do that with time. I'm involved with coaching, my kids' teams, all that side of it as well. So weekends are precious as well. But I said to myself, if I can at least once a month go on a travel, as in, couple of hours beyond Tipperary to actually reach out and go to these places that are on my bucket list. And there's so much fishing in Ireland, even just Ireland alone. You could spend a lifetime just going around it. So that was it. I made that commitment to myself. And funny enough, actually, it was my wife said to me, and I write about it in the prologue, I think, is where every time I come back from fishing, my wife says, my God, you look revitalized, rejuvenated, takes years off it. And I remember one day I came back from the Blackwater, and I don't think I actually caught salmon at the time, but there was just something in that moment where I was casting well, I was standing in the river, the conditions were beautiful. I think I had the beat to myself, and the day was fabulous. And I just remember standing there going, wow, this, if I could just bottle this moment, And afterwards, I think I described to my wife, said, oh, it's like being in heaven, And she said, well, if I could go to heaven every time by just driving down the road 15 minutes, I'd be doing a lot more than you're doing it. And it kind of struck a chord to me. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't be taking it for granted, if it can bring me such joy and, just relaxation and being able to switch off. So that was kind of, I suppose, then the kind of maybe the light bulb moment that when I was stuck in Dublin, the wintry night, struggling to get home through the commuter traffic, I said, no, I'm going to make that commitment to myself. So that's where it started. So I said, right, the Jazz, I'm going to do it. And what I find as well is, I don't know about yourself, Pete, I'm like, if you pay for it and book it, if it's paid for, you're going to do it because there's no refunds. It was a bit like, I think, if I wanted to, for example, I was going to, get into pike fishing more, buy myself a decent rod and kit, because if it's there lying in front of me, I'm going to feel guilty about not using it. So there's a bit of that kind of trickery involved. So that's what I did. I spent I suppose the next few weeks. So I said, right, Dres, book the fishery, book the B&B. Just said, right, I'm going. That's it. I'm doing it. And then likewise, went to booked Connemara for the Delphi and Ballynahinch. Also booked the Quran down in Kerry, mayfly fishing up in Corrib. And I booked these with, guides I knew of. And, I knew I was going for the day and night. So I was making a proper trip out of it. And then the Dodder as well. And again, the Dodder it was just a different one. It was just something more unique about it. So I made the commitment, got in touch with Daire Whelan, and just to go up there and fish and do it. So through planning it, I kind of made that commitment to myself. It's a form of self-care, in many respects. And it's something that I think, like I said, I bring it back to not to take for granted. We do it. We fish for ourselves all the time, but maybe it's worth now and again, stepping back and kind of appreciating why we do it and what we get out of it, rather than maybe getting caught up in the, I didn't catch enough, or, it just wasn't happening for me, or, maybe just, it was actually just appreciate just kind of why we're doing it in the first place. And that for me was kind of the moment when I sat down, planned it out, and then I was able to kind of make it happen. And then it was afterwards, then I started to write about it because it just flowed from what I had experienced.
It's interesting. There's a couple of things I wanted to mention. I love in the book how you describe, as you said, how you were standing on a train platform as you start your daily commute and wondering what it would be like to take the train in the opposite direction, to take you away, as you described, from that humdrum or hamster wheel, as you've also described, of life. And also from a writing perspective, I find if I've had a great day fishing, it just flows. And it's very easy to write something when something has been memorable or very good. And do you find you can sort of knock pieces out pretty quickly in a pretty good shape to almost say this is almost there pretty quickly when it's been that special day? And I guess having guides as well, hiring guides to help you, probably helps in that process as well, doesn't it?
Oh, 100%. Because for me, the most interesting part of fishing is, freedom for me, the most interesting is the people I get to fish with. So if I'm hiring a guide or wherever I'm fishing with, and also just finding out, like, I don't know, maybe it's, wherever I go, I'm just fascinated by what's that rune over there? What's the story? Like, I'll give you a good example, like Quran down in Kerry, being a good example. Waterville, south of Kerry, if anybody's fishing for the famous sea trout fishery. And, you're on the lake, and I don't know if anybody knows it, Church Island. So there's a ruin of a church there. And I remember saying to Neil O'Shea, the gilly, what's that? And he said, oh, that's, Church Island, that's St. Fionan's old church, dates back to the 6th century. And I was like, well, I think the ruin, the original ruin is, the ruin that's there is 12th century, but there's actual foundations that goes back to the 6th. And so my next question was, who's St. Fionnan? So then, you're told about it. And then even afterwards, when I go home, I'm digging into it a bit more, just trying to find out, oh my God, St. Fionnan, he was the saint. He set up all these monasteries in the area. And then you delve back into the Celtic mythology. So suddenly my picture of fishing goes from, caught a few sea trout, which was absolutely brilliant, and I loved it, to, wow, that was a sea trout fishery that was really important back in the 6th century, and back in the Celtic days, it was really important. So suddenly this bigger, wider picture opens to me, and that to me is a lot more interesting from a purely writing perspective, because it's not just, I went to Quran and caught a few sea trout, and in fairness, there's a huge skill to that. I couldn't do that. Like John Gierach, the stuff he writes, where he's talking about going fishing. And really, it's a lot of the humdrum of fishing, but written in an incredible way, I think, because of the characters. But for me, what I had to write was to bring in all the different elements to it, because for me, that's a lot more interesting. And I hope people find it too.
Yeah, absolutely. The way you describe things is wonderful. And I was going to say, is this book a love letter to the fishing of Ireland? But possibly, is it a love letter to Ireland, really?
Yeah, it's funny, actually. Some people are kind of taking it beyond that, in terms of not just the fishing. Because, like I said, I studied history. I'm fascinated by that side of it in terms of the interweaving of it. Like even the Drowse fishery, and when we spoke about January the 1st, in terms of the early salmon, there's a bridge that goes over one of the beats there. It's called the Four Masters Bridge. And that's a monument to there was a monastery near there, which 1,000 years ago, 4 monks, hence the Four Masters, wrote about the original history of Ireland. And so it was going this was like the first kind of complete, now there's there's a lot of kind of mythology and made up stuff put into it at the time. But it was this first kind of complete kind of history that was written. So again, I'm crossing that bridge going, wow, there's a link. For me, it goes back to, it's just that link. It's not like fly fishing is new. It's not like us casting a line on a river for a salmon or a trout is relatively modern or recent. And obviously, yeah, we can go back to, to Walton, the complete angler, and we can go back down. But even if it's not written in stone, I still see the foundations and I still see the monuments that I know were relating to fishing and salmon and trout in some way. Because the land and nature was all part of it. So that for me is maybe what part of the intrigue and the beauty of it is.
Yeah. You also interweave conservation within the book. And, I was thinking about the urban trout and sea trout, as you mentioned, on the Dodder, and how the gentleman who was fishing with you happened to be on the river and spotted salmon. And he said, there were people drinking their lattes, I think was the term, and they were sort of passing. He said he pointed out the salmon and the sea trout to these people who may have just walked past that river and not realised what was going on there. That was, for me, a beautiful moment as well. Really cool.
It is incredible, isn't it? So just by way of kind of background, so the Dodder is, a small river that flows through south of Dublin from the Wicklow Mountains and eventually joins up with the Liffey. But Ken Whelan, who I interviewed and fished with, Ken, people might know him as the fishery scientist, research director with the Atlantic Salmon Trust, hugely knowledgeable guy. He grew up near enough to the Dodder. And like he recounts, growing up, basically how it was a guy called Ned Cusack, who, and again, we talk about kind of passion, right? And the whole story in this, so Ned was a passionate fly angler, and he started introducing the kids in the area to the Dodder and the beauty of the fishing there and the nature and the importance of the river. Because at the time then Dublin was starting to expand around that area. So you had industrial estates being built, you had housing estates being built. And Ned and people like him around the River Dodder were trying to protect the river from this industrialization. And this would have been back in the 1970s, as Ken explains it to me. And they were nearly seen as the trippy dippy hippies, standing in the way of progress, and they were kind of saying, no, this is a living, breathing thing. You can't just dump whatever into it. There's consequences for your actions for all of us. So they were standing up to it. And I remember even Ken telling me about one time, Ken was a trained fishery scientist, and he gets a call about some spill into the river, and very quickly he was able to get a sample of it and send it off to a laboratory to find out exactly what was in it. And they were able to trace it to a factory nearby. And they were getting threats and stuff for kind of, who do you think you are standing in the way of progress? But what they did was, and again, you trace it back to somebody like the influence of one person, like Ned, who was able to influence Ken, who became a fishery scientist. They also influenced the local people, the neighbours. So they mightn't have been into fishing, but there was a Dodder action group. So that every Saturday, and I think they still do it, where they organise cleanups along the riverbank, because all the communities can enjoy the river. So you can go for a walk along the river, you can go for a run along the river, people bring their dogs along there, and you can fish as well if you're into the fishing side of it. So people have a collective kind of belonging and sense of ownership around the Dodder. And as a result, and also helped greatly, as Ken points out, by the EU Fisheries Directive in terms of the clean water policy, you've now got, and I think they were saying it's the only river in a capital city in Europe that has salmon, sea trout and brown trout within the city confines of a capital city. So as a result, I went fishing with Ken, even during the day. I went down, we did a bit of nymphing and a bit of dry fly for brown trout. And it was kind of incredible. You're facing the river, and it could be any kind of small river that you're fishing on. There's bushes and there's trees and stuff, hanging overhead. And I think there was even a heron at one stage. And, and there's a trout rising to my fly. And, you're catching that. And then you turn around and then there's a double-decker bus driving by on a dual carriageway. It was just the the dichotomy of it was just, it was incredible. So if you just focused on the river, you could have been in Connemara or somewhere, and it's incredible to think that this was there. And then that evening, then I went with Ken, we went sea trout fishing. So it was just amazing, for one day of, going by. And I think I write a bit in the book where you're catching sea trout and under the light of, a street light as buses are going by, the last bus of of a Saturday night, bringing revelers home. While here we were, catching sea trout under the streetlights. It was an amazing experience, and it just shows in terms of the wide range in terms of fishing that's on offer. And obviously I know in England you've got there's a lot in terms of kind of the urban trout and a lot of organisation being done around that. But for me, the Daire was most particular in the sense of what the influence of people and communities around kind of interest and collective ownership around protecting the resource and how important that was and how everybody was able to enjoy it. Yes, they had to stand up to, industrial vested interest at the time, but they came through that. And, in fairness, I think they're a model for kind of other communities to kind of look at how they can make the most of rivers that are flowing through their areas.
Yeah, one of the things that made me smile was you said about the sea trouting, and you said usually when you're sea trouting, you wait for the colour to go out of the grass. But it was slightly tricky when you've got a street lamp. And so I kind of like that. I guess it's easy for changing flies as well. So there is an advantage to it as well, I guess, in some respects. But that was really, really enjoyable. You talk about fishing corib and mayfly and dapping. And I really, really enjoyed the story, the history. Like you say, you like to go into the history of the famous fishing at the Delphi and how that whole business started, how difficult it was, the triumphs, the tribulations, the changes in ownership and everything else, again, intertwined beautifully with fishing. But that must have been a fascinating, I can't remember the gentleman's first name. I know it's Mr. Mantle. Was it Peter Mantle?
Yes, Peter Mantle. Yeah. I hope he's listening to this. Shout out to Peter for his fantastic guy. And again, for me, it was about, it's about the fishing there, but again, the backstory to it. And what I got really out of that was, like, for Peter, it was about, and this is any walk of life, and again, the kind of the truths are universal was he owned and ran this fishery there, it's hugely successful. People from all over the world come to fish it. And you would think, oh God, that's a great life, great job. But my God, the obstacles he had to overcome every time, the difficulties. And for me, the truth's in that where you don't give up. You keep at it, whatever you're doing. Yeah, we're all going to get difficulties no matter what. There's always going to be obstacles thrown in our path. But you know what? If you believe in what you're doing enough, you keep at it. So again, by way of kind of background, Peter, English guy, he was working in financial journalism. He used to come over to Ireland to do a bit of salmon fishing. I think it was originally on the Blackwater. Himself and his friend got talking one day. Oh, I'd love to own a bit of salmon fishing in Ireland. They saw a piece, there was a beat for sale in the Blackwater. That fell through. But what happened was the idea had begun in his head and he wouldn't let it go. And he got a health scare anyway, which kind of forced him to kind of reevaluate his life and kind of what he wanted out of life. And lo and behold, he gets a call from an estate agent, the west of Ireland. The Marquis of Sligo was looking to sell one of his estates, one of his country lodges, which happened to be Delphi. Now it was all run down and everything, but like I remember Peter saying, he was able to sell what he was able to sell his flat in London for. This would have been in the 1980s. He was able to buy Delphi Lodge, the lakes, the fish, basically the valley. At the time, like it just, this was like, so again, it's not like people were beating down the door at the time saying, oh, I want to come to Ireland to do salmon fishing. This was Ireland of the Troubles, depression. It was a tough time for the country, but he just had this vision, had this idea, and he was able to buy it. And then he had to basically timeshare it, is how he said it. Was basically, that's how he raised further funds to do it up. People basically did a timeshare for a week, on a beat every year, and it went from there. But like even then, so every time I spent an absolutely brilliant couple of hours up in Peter's cottage in Connemara at the time. And so every time he's telling the story, then another problem comes, and but he does it in a very jovial kind of way. And so then they found out like there was the whole problem with a fish farm out in the bay. So that there was the problem with sea lice and the sea trout and the salmon. And so then they introduced the hatchery. Then there was a problem there. Then there was one of the early days they were opening. Turns out there was a bit of gold discovered in the hills up behind them. And suddenly then he was like, he had this nightmare vision of, oh my God, they're going to just turn it into a mine. There's going to be like these diggers. It's going to be like a, industrial kind of excavation going on. So every time there was like all these, but you know what? Every time it was like, you just had to meet it head on. And I said to him, did you never think, I better give this up? Like, I was like, and he says, no, it's kind of too far gone, too far down the road. And this was what he wanted. And he kept at it, and fair play to him. It came good in the end. And, then he subsequently set up the Delphi in the Bahamas. And now he's back in England, actually, kind of semi-retired on the Test, I think it is. He's got a small accommodation there. So, but again, incredible story. So this is kind of the by. I happen to be salmon fishing in the Delphi. And this is the kind of stories that I find out as, because that's the thing. Imagine going to somewhere like Delphi, salmon fishing there. And yes, incredible fishing, catch beautiful salmon, beautiful surroundings, but not to know any of that background or backdrop to where you're fishing, I think would be a shame.
Yeah, no, I think that's wonderful. One of the other things I wanted to touch on, which I thought was a beautifully written piece as well, was the day you had with your son, Ryan, where you went to a trout fishery and then caught some trout. And I think you were, like you were saying, elated from that day, but then you got home and was about to sit down and relax and kick back. And then you thought, I want to squeeze some more out of that day. And you go and hit the river. And I guess you were pretty pleased you did, weren't you?
Yeah, that was one of those kind of red letter days, isn't it? And it's kind of one of those, it's the ones you don't plan or you don't expect. So it's kind of, I suppose, like for that, and again, to me, it's about, I find sometimes when you fish on your own, like I don't have, yes, I'm a member of the clubs nearby, but I didn't grow up with people. I don't know people, and again, I'm a bit of a blow-in. So if I go fishing with people, it's generally if I'm hiring a guide, I'm going somewhere. But if I'm going locally, I don't know anyone. So generally I'm fishing my own. And I find the kind of extra spurt there, I need to kind of push myself out. There's a bit of discipline involved, or, just to kind of get yourself out. Sometimes it's just too easy at the end of a long week. Kids are in bed, you want to just sit down, read a book, have a glass of wine. That's a lot easier. And it sounds terrible, even when I say it. The river's 5 minutes down the road for me. There's no excuse, Sometimes when it's easier like that, maybe that's, part of the problem. So, yeah, I think I hadn't been fishing for a while for whatever reason. And I know Ryan, my eldest, Ryan is 9 and Charlie's 7 and Gloria now 4. And what I love actually with them is just... they've always grown up with like rods and fishing pictures and magazines around. So they've even sometimes when they're playing, just doing make believe play, I hear them going, "Oh, I've got a big salmon. I'm reeling in a salmon." That's just part of their imaginative play, which I absolutely love because they know it's just part of my life. So they've kind of just taken it on board as well. And which I hope in some way, shape or form will continue with them. And if anything for me, it's actually just on my kids is, I hope I've at least left them with a love of nature and an appreciation of nature that will stay with them for their generation. So if anything, if fishing can do that, that's a win-win. But just on that, yeah, I think, so Ryan had been at me go fishing. So, I've taken them to the shore, and it's a wild trout. It's a difficult enough in terms of it's a big enough river. It's not the kind of place you want to be bringing young kids. So I'd often bring them to, one of those kind of stocked trout fisheries. It's not really my cup of tea, but it's great because they get to like a small little lake and they see the fish literally at their feet, and the excitement when they see it. So Ryan caught his first rainbow, was thrilled, and it lifted something in me again. It kind of lifted the clouds. Just seeing I'd cast out the fly, and then I'd hand him the rod and he'd, take in the line and, and he struck and he got the fish, and it was just something for me. And I just kind of said, feck it. I got home. I said, oh, look, I'm getting out. like, this is it. I want to just get out for myself. Just something told me, just get out and do it. So yeah, I ended up, and I think that was the one. My phone wasn't working. I had an old phone, so do you ever know, when your smartphone goes and dies and it's off getting fixed and you're floundering around like an idiot, like, oh my God, what am I going to do? And I had one of these old flip phones as a backup. And I caught my net. Oh yeah, that was it as well. My net was broken as well. I'd taken out the net and the thing jammed. I had to throw that into the bushes. I took it away afterwards. But I was, I think it was like, and literally, so I was there. I was alone on the beach, and it was pretty much dark, and there's fish rising, and I'd caught, I think, one or two fine, decent, probably, nice enough fish, kind of maybe 3/4 pound. And then next minute, boom, this one took it. Couldn't even see it. I was just casting in the dark at this stage, and I just knew, when you just feel the pull, and it was not giving an inch. And I finally managed to get in close to the bank. Looked, of course, my net's gone. And literally it's dark. I can't even see now. I'm not even sure. And I just said, feck it. I'm just going to have to take this risk. I didn't want to risk pulling in the leader. I just couldn't lose it. I didn't even have a phone on me. I took out my phone to see if I could take a picture. The phone had died. So this was this old Nokia phone. I was literally, because like oftentimes I'd come home, my wife would go, how's the fishing? Ah, yeah, grand. She knows if that's what I say, it means I haven't got anything. Ah, yeah, grand, don't ask. And but I knew, I said, this is a brilliant fish. This could be the best fish I've had so far in the shore. And I remember I just took a leap of faith. Actually, I don't think I even had my waders. I think there was a leak in them as well. I think I even had hip waders. I think I was wearing at the time or something. I just said, jump. So I just jumped down from the bank onto the reeds. Did not know how deep it was going to be. Luckily, the reeds were thick enough that they kind of just managed to kind of half submerge me, half hold me up. And I was able to get close enough to grab hold of the leader to pull it in. Of course, couldn't take a picture because I had no phone. And all I could do was just literally, I had the fish kind of lying there, kind of half in the water in the reeds. And I was just marveled at it. Like, he was a couple of pounds. He was just my best fish. All you want to do, I wish, even telling you now, I wish I could have a look at that picture. But I think there's even something maybe more special in the fact that it's just in my memory. It is true. It's a real one. I will say that. But there's something so special about just maybe having it there in my mind, and that's where it'll rest forevermore. And maybe that's as big and as good as it'll get. And if so, well, do you know what? It was worth it.
Fantastic. Lovely story. It's interesting that you said about the lifting, and I remember in the book now that you said, you hadn't been fishing for a bit, and going with Ryan sort of lifted you, and then this lifted you some more. And it's funny, isn't it, that when you don't fish, and I've not fished a great deal over winter because of weather, because I had a little bit of a breather. Yeah, I went fishing last week with a friend, and it's amazing. You don't realize how it does actually recharge. When you're doing it all the time, fine. But when you haven't done it and then you go, there is a very distinct, almost high as a result of it, isn't there?
It is. And it's funny, Pete, it's the more you work, and so usually what will happen for me, and I'm sure this is for most people, you'll be working on a project, you'll be working on something, that's a couple of weeks of just on the grindstone, and, you barely get to lift your head up. And you don't get the fish, and you realize why you're so stressed and under pressure and feeling crap. And you actually realize it's because you haven't fished. That if, it's a bit like the kind of the phrase, if somebody says, they say, look, if somebody's under stress, you need to do some meditation, or mindfulness. And somebody says, I don't have the time, and they says, well, if you don't have the time for half an hour of meditation, you know what the answer is? You need an hour's meditation. So basically, if you don't have the time, you actually need to make the time no matter what. And then when you actually just, push yourself out there and do it, you kind of think about, why didn't I do that for the last 4 weeks? You're kind of thinking to yourself, how could I have, gotten out of the habit? And for me, it's actually, I suppose, when I first started fishing, it was something special and something adventurous and something unique and something to be kind of looked forward to as a special occasion. Now I'm kind of increasingly kind of seeing it more like, exercise. Like I exercise, I work out every day, I ride every day. it's just something that I think I have to build in as a habit. I'm not going out, not to make it such a big thing. Oh, I'm going out fishing. It's just something I do. And I think I need to build that in more so that it just becomes a natural thing where you don't even think too much about it, because sometimes maybe I think too much about it in terms of, oh, have I got, is it the right conditions? Have I got the right tackle? Have I got whatever? Do I need to be doing this? Just do it, just go out. I'm one of the guys I used to, I remember interviewing before, I loved talking about it, was James Clear's book, Atomic Habits. It's a brilliant book, New York Times bestseller. And basically he's talking about breaking it down into small things if you want to make something a habit. And he tells this great story of this guy who wanted to go to the gym. So what the guy used to do was he'd get his gym bag, drive to the gym, walk in, turn around, get back into the car and drive home. Right? So didn't work out. Just literally walked in, walked back out again. But the whole thing was just building that sense of habit and routine. So after a week or two of this, he might have spent 5 minutes in the gym and then he comes. So anyway, so the whole point of this story was you just build in small routines, and it's a bit like people say, oh, I don't have time to write. I say, really, you don't have 10 minutes in your whole day? And especially like I'm not a fan of social media, especially if people are on social media, I say, really think about, how much dead time you've spent just aimlessly flicking through your phone. That's a half an hour gone when you could be reading, you could be writing, you could be doing stuff that you actually want to do. And if you've got an hour, if you're lucky enough, that you live close enough to a water, that you could get out and fish. So for me, it's just about building that habit, because it lifts you up. So if it does lift you up every time, why not stay there on a regular basis? That's my take on it.
Yeah, and that's good advice all round. And like you say about the social media, I've had so many conversations about it on here as well. And I've found more recently, I've just have a pile of books that I dip into. So I finished yours. I'm halfway through Mark Kalansky's second fishing book. So I'll go back into that. I've got Bill Bryson's The Body that I'm working my way through. I've got something about JMW Turner and his artwork, and just vary things instead of picking up a phone. And you're dead right about that. And we had somebody around the other day to quote on some work, and he said, well, what I do is set up a WhatsApp group. And I said, well, there's no point me being on that, because I don't want to do that sort of stuff. And so I've cut a lot of that stuff out now and just focusing on stuff I want to focus on. And I found that really, really good to do as well, and look at other things as well, because being so deeply entrenched in fishing, sometimes it's nice to actually step outside and see what's going on in the rest of the world as well. So I'm kind of enjoying that. But before, we're coming up over an hour now, but I said earlier that the book intertwines with conservation as well, and the state of rivers, and it would be wrong of me not to bring this up. And I thought one of the points you brought up was one of the fisheries, it may have been at the very beginning, I can't quite remember now, that you quote a catch book from 1941, which even then made some grim reading. Were you coming at that from the point of view that things were starting to happen then, or were you saying, are there cycles of these things? How were you thinking about that? And how do things look from a migratory fish perspective now? And is it fixable?
Yeah, that was actually, it was in relation to, it was a conversation I had with Shane Gallagher and the Drows. And I remember sitting in Shane's basement office looking out into the river one evening, and we were having a whiskey and we were going through, he was showing me some of the old record books. And so we were talking about the runs and the fish, because I said I would not like to be a fishery owner in terms of the conditions and the consistency and, the control, lack of control that you have in terms of, the fish runs. And, I remember Shane telling me about, and he was talking about, he said, look at this. He says, wait till I show you. And he showed me the record books, saying they had bad days back then as well, So there is the danger, isn't there? So he was trying to have, the nostalgia, the rose tinted glasses. 50 years ago, which was so much better. And, he showed me, well, actually 50 years ago, they were saying it was, my God. So I think, look, that's just natural, isn't it? From a fly fishing kind of perspective. But for me, the wider perspective is, I think it's one of the words I use, and it is change. That there is change happening. We know there's change happening from a societal perspective, from an environmental, from a climate change perspective, from a cultural, you just feel that we're in this state of flux, this state of change. I heard an interview recently with George Saunders, the writer, and I thought it was a good point. He mentioned about how maybe just the last few years where, pre-pandemic, we've just been living in this bubble of unreality. Maybe we all used to think the pandemic was just a bubble, but he says, like, if you look at the history of mankind, civilization, it's actually, there's a lot of kind of like, pestilence, famine, wars. He says, maybe we've actually just been living in a bubble these last few decades where life has been kind of nice and simple and easy. And actually now we're just going back to the way things normally are, which is pandemics and, bad stuff happening. Like, he says, maybe just get used to that because that's actually reality. But in the sense of change, for me, it's like you see it all, you hear, especially from salmon fishing perspective, in terms of like the numbers. I think numbers of smolts, I think they're down from 15% down to 5% survival rate. I remember reading that before. And the problem is, and I know there's a certain thing that we can control in terms of what's going on in the rivers, whether it's catch and release or, whether it's predators or whether it's, pollution, that side of it. But then there's so much we don't know that's happening out in the wider oceans. And I think that's the scary thing. And it's the scary thing, we talked about at the start of this conversation about the conditions on the Drowse being 14 degrees on January the 1st. It's scary things like that, the change that's happening that we have no control over, or we have so little say, or that we're unable to actually, have a real impact in terms of where the future is going. That I think that's the maybe bigger picture that's kind of worrying for the future. So not about kind of short-term fishing, it was bad fishing today. It's what's really going to be happening in 20, 30, 40 years. And I'm fascinated by the kind of salmon. And this is my area I'd love to focus maybe the next book on, is kind of the future of salmon. Because the salmon are a bit of the kind of the canary in the mine, because they come through the oceans where so much change is happening. They come up into our rivers, and we're seeing the kind of the final end product of kind of what they have to suffer and go through. And what that is reflective of the kind of the flux that's going on in the planet as a whole. And I think looking forwards in terms of kind of the change that's happening is going to be, it's going to be monumental. It's going to be drastic. It's going to be big. I remember actually just speaking to Ken Whelan before Christmas about this, the fishery scientist. And he says, look, it's the cold waters, obviously, is what the salmon needs. So he says, they're increasingly moving northward. We're seeing fish now in the Irish coast that you would have traditionally seen in the Mediterranean. So, and Ken was even telling me about like salmon that have adapted. They were stock salmon, but they've adapted to the hot water conditions in the likes of Spain. That we're now probably going to, if we want salmon, we're talking kind of generations, but if you want to see salmon around, say, cold waters of Ireland, Scotland, wherever, that maybe you might have to look at kind of introducing these salmon that have adapted to the warm waters of Spain, if you actually want them off your own waters. So it's that kind of change that I'm concerned about and worried about as you look forward.
Yeah, it is, like you say, it's worrying, and I don't know if nature does fix itself given half a chance, or whether we give it a hand. I honestly don't know. My hope is that we do see some sort of change. But like you say, climate's going to be a big issue, and I don't know how we halt the change of that right now. So, yeah, I don't, as I said, we've talked over an hour now, and I don't want to end on a low there, but it's inevitable, isn't it? And I'm almost fishing, this season. I had one last year, I had one come off, that was it. And I'm sort of preparing myself mentally for this season, in the sense of I'm going to fish a fiberglass rod. I'm just going to enjoy it, and a fish, which I always do, but whether a fish will become just a happy byproduct of that process. And that would be the topping on top of the cake. But everything else underneath it, I'm enjoying equally as much. So I don't know if I'm mentally preparing myself for that. It may be something else happens, but fingers crossed that something does and we do see a change. But it's been really, really cool to speak with you today, Daire. And the book, Haunted by Water, so I don't get paid to say these things. I don't I do it because it's a really good book, and I read every page of them. The reason I wanted you on here was A, it was wonderful to catch up, but second, I know our listeners would enjoy this sort of book and everything that it talks about. And some of the places I fished, I know. Some of the places I actually went on the Delphi website and had a look. And I've been aware of it for years and years. I remember the Delphi Diary and Trout and Salmon years back and all those sorts of things. And it did have that effect on me because of your wonderful writing. So thank you for writing that book. And I hope there is a follow-up from a fishing perspective. I hope you'll write some more for Fly Culture as well. But for our listeners, if they want to buy a copy of Haunted by Waters, how do they do that?
I suppose best place online on Amazon probably for anybody listening in the UK, in Ireland. You get it in the local bookshops. But yeah, if you're listening outside, amazon.co.uk, you'd have it. And do please. I hope you enjoy it. And thanks a million, Pete, for the opportunity. I've really, really enjoyed it. I think it's similar in terms of kind of the pieces you've been kind enough to publish in your magazine. That it's been you're willing and able to go places that are just beyond the kind of normal expectations, which I think is very gratifying as a writer and as a fly angler, and continued success for yourself, and long may it continue.
Thank you so much. And also you have a podcast as well. So Ireland on the Fly, how do people find that?
Yeah, Ireland on the Fly podcast. We started it, and it's been kind of every kind of 2 weeks we do episodes. It's a bit like the book, talking to people involved in the kind of the culture and the history of fly fishing in Ireland. So if the book has whetted your appetite, or if you want to find a bit more in terms of listen to the characters that we've mentioned today and find out more about fly fishing in Ireland, yeah, do check it out. It's on all your usual podcast platforms.
Fantastic, Daire. It's been brilliant to speak to you. Thank you so much, and giving us a fascinating insight to what went into Haunted by Waters. So thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. I hope your season is a good and a productive one too. And I hope the book gets the success that it really does deserve.
Thanks a million, Pete, and thanks again for your time.
Thanks, everyone. That has been the Fly Culture Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this one as much as me. And as ever, there will be plenty more down the line. If you're enjoying them and you'd like to receive your weekly Fly Culture Podcast, just consider subscribing. I'd greatly appreciate it. Thanks so much for listening.
The Fly Culture Podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter.